this is a very, very difficult position for all countries, of course. I think it's natural that the UK jumps to the support of Israel with this barbaric terrorist attack, which you have to compare to something like 9/11. Actually, in relative terms, the casualties for a nation of 10 million people are far greater than in the case of 9/11. So absolutely, we have to stand with Israel. These Hamas terrorists deserve no mercy. But I think what Raj is also getting at is that in Gaza, there are Hamas terrorists, but there are also 2.5 million people, most of whom will have had absolutely nothing to do with the decision to attack Israel. We were hearing from Colonel Simon about the implications of a siege. A humanitarian catastrophe must already be forming in Gaza. And I think for Israel and her long-term security, Israeli leaders need to think about, where does this lead? They attack terrorists in Gaza, but then what happens after that? Who governs Gaza? Who gives the population there some room for hope? Because really the answer to Raj's question is that the whole Middle East needs a degree of hope and stability, and Israel's policy in the next few weeks is going to be quite important in how that plays out.
A related question via the text before I go to the next question on the calls. I think staying with you if I can, Lord Ricketts. Anthony in Dartford. Can someone explain, if Israel moves on Gaza, why do they not have to move on the West Bank? What is the difference? Can you take that on, Lord Ricketts?
I can try, yes. I think Israel tries to make a distinction between Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza has been run since 2005 by Hamas, which is now classified in the UK as well as a terrorist organization. The West Bank is run by the Palestinian Authority, who are not as radical, not as determined to undermine the state of Israel. It's a pretty inefficient and corrupt administration in the West Bank, but I think they do treat the two separately. There are many, many Israelis, of course, who live on the West Bank now in settlements. And so I think the Israelis are hoping to deal with the Gaza problem separately. The history is not very encouraging in that. I mean, there have been a series of Israeli invasions of Gaza in the last 15 years. None of them have produced stability. But I think the Israelis do see that difference. They withdrew from Gaza in 2005. They are still very much the occupying power in the West Bank.
Lord Ricketts, thank you. I sense the next question might be going in the direction of Colonel Diggins, so have a tea, coffee, water, whatever you choose. As Eli, appropriately enough in Jerusalem, sets his question. Go ahead, Eli. Morning.
Hi, good morning, Nick.
Yeah.
Yes, just a question from a military standpoint. Is there any realistic possibility of getting the hostages back without a full ground invasion, or is that just too much to ask for?
Any sense in negotiating, Colonel Diggins, or does it? And also go through, I don't know if you have working knowledge of the area, I've seen video. It looks to me like a desperately difficult area to penetrate successfully without taking a lot of casualties.
I think it is. I mean, Gaza Strip is regarded as the third most populated area in the world in terms of density. So in terms of any kind of military operations in such an environment, they just absorb people. I mean, not necessarily in fighting, but just in terms of being able to provide security, routes in, routes out, and everything that goes with that. I mean, I always, with hostages, even in situations like this, one hopes that there's another way of dealing with the issue. And despite the despicable behaviour of Hamas and its leaders, there will be people who can talk to them and just say, this is not in your interest to use that. I mean, Hamas last night threatened to execute publicly on TV a hostage for every bomb that landed on the rocket came to it. Thank God, as I understand at the moment, they haven't carried out that particular threat, but that shows the level of desperation they're in. I can only just imagine that the horror, and Mr. Eli reading from Jerusalem, the horror of the families who know their families have been caught up in this. And we hope and pray that a peaceful solution can happen in terms of rescuing those hostages. But you asked the question, is it difficult to get people out in those circumstances? I fear the answer to that is it's very difficult. We hope we can find a peaceful solution to that, but I would suggest that it's going to be very difficult for them to extract hostages, given what Hamas have done and given the threats that have been made.
Before we go back to another question, just lastly on this, Colonel, do we have any sense now, after 2 or 3 days, how the back door was effectively left so open for this terror attack? It seems, if you'll allow, that it has to be some of the best military intelligence, certainly in the region, if not on the planet. What on earth went wrong, Colonel?
I mean, I think two things probably happened. The first thing is that Hamas seemed to have mounted a fairly major deception operation. So over the last 3 or 4 months, since the last major attack, which is in 21, the last of ceasefire, they have said to have been focusing on jobs, work permits for Gaza citizens to go into Israel and worked in those. So they mounted a fairly major, if you like, deception operation against the Israelis, trying to give the impression that the kind of land for peace solution would be in place. They've done that. At the same time, they've obviously been planning hard. And here I think you have got an issue around failure of intelligence. Now, clearly, there's going to be some massive equivalent of kind of commissions looking into what happened. But there, I mean, I think the issue is still very live. If Israel could be so badly deceived by what's happened, then what else is going on now? What's the next stage for Hamas? Was this it? Were they just going to conduct an invasion and go? The other thing I'd add to that, and Lord Ricketts maybe I'd answer this for that. What about the rest of the world? Given we know the linkages between Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and while we don't think that Iran actually sort of ordered the invasion, but clearly they permitted it, and clearly they supported them in terms of the logistics involved for this. Where was the wider West's intelligence operators? Where were they looking, and why were they looking in this direction as well? Because this is a major strategic shock to the world. This is the third one that's emanated out of the Middle East: Yom Kippur, 9/11, and now this one. So there's clearly issues there. Israel, yes, what happened in terms of your intelligence operators, but also the rest of the world as well. So there is something there as well.
Let's bring Lord Ricketts into that. I'm sure you heard the question that Simon put, the sort of, I have to say, the world was effectively caught napping as well. Lord Ricketts.
Yes, I think if there had been any advanced knowledge of this, it would have been passed on to Israel. They could have acted to seal the border before it happened. I think the honest answer, I fear, is that the Israeli intelligence overestimated the capacity to which they had Hamas and the Gaza Strip under very close surveillance. We all imagined that they had very, very good sources, that they'd penetrated the Hamas organization and so on. It looks like they managed to keep security around an operation that involved 1,000 fighters or more. Quite extraordinary. So yes, there will be some very hard questions asked indeed. There will be a reckoning, both for the intelligence community and, I suspect, for the political leadership in Israel as well.
Can the Colonel give us an idea what happened to the so-called famous dome that's cost billions of dollars but clearly failed, and how much kit and rockets does he think Hamas has? Colonel?
I'd say that the Iron Dome did not fail. I mean, to contradict the lady, if I may, but it's estimated that it's between 75 and 85% effective. What Hamas tried to do was overwhelming with sheer volumes and numbers. The initial report suggested that something like 4,000 rockets were fired at Israel. Actually, in retrospect, it seems to be a little bit half that. But that's still, 2,500 rockets or plus being fired at it. A significant number of which were actually intercepted and destroyed before they hit the ground. But of course, some did hit the ground and have caused significant casualties as well. So I'm not sure it's failed. All weapon systems, particularly defence systems, have, if you like, a percentage success rate attached to them. The Israelis will be looking very hard, indeed other people will be looking very hard to see how successful it was. They will probably tell you that it was successful within its parameters. And they, as I say, they claim it at being 75 to 85% successful, depending on where the missiles coming at them. And Hamas knew this, which is why they tried to overwhelm them with sheer numbers.
And Hamas's capability, the level of kit. Well, Simon, where does it come from and how much have they got?
Well, the origins of their kit, frankly, is Iran. I mean, not necessarily directly in terms of producing missiles themselves. I mean, their primary missile they have is a model that's based on an Iranian system. A lot of it now is homemade and very sophisticated is too. One estimate said they had up to 30,000 rockets available in their arsenal, which seems a huge amount of numbers from there. But this is what they managed to produce on Saturday was in itself a major logistic achievement. So the number, I think we can just say, they have many, many thousand rockets, and no doubt have many more thousands of rockets available too. They'll be very wary of firing them because Israelis have now been looking for them to what they can counter battery fire onto those locations themselves. So we can expect many more thousands to come from it. But in origin is from Iran, sometimes through Iran's proxy Hezbollah in the southern Lebanon, but Hamas has its own capabilities in terms of production and everything goes with it. So I think the linkage, and everyone's looking very hard at the linkages to Tehran. One of them is intelligence, equipment, and also the information about producing it, rather than necessarily directly supplying the weapons themselves.
Colonel, thank you. To a diplomatic question, Mick in Sutton Coldfield. Why can't we put in a UN or NATO peacekeeping force in the area? We've done it in the Balkans, Africa and elsewhere. What is the reason that the UN is not doing more? Lord Ricketts?
Well, I'm a Sutton Coldfield boy myself. So hello, Nick. Good morning to you. Well, I think the honest answer is it is an incredibly dangerous war zone right now, and I don't think any international forces would want to go in there. Certainly not the UN, and it's well beyond what NATO would want to do. I think given the level of violence, given what happens when you occupy another country, as we've found to our cost in Iraq and Afghanistan, you've taken an enormous number of casualties yourselves. I think there has got to be a degree of stability before even the UN could think of doing anything at all on the ground.
Thanks for that, Lord Ricketts. Mike in Woking. We might stay with you, actually, Lord Ricketts. It will come to both contributors, but Mike, go first while I have Lord Ricketts on the line. Go ahead, sir. Morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. I think when you describe Israel, you always describe it as Israel and the occupied territories. Yeah. Now, I'm not a major history buff, but when has anybody who has occupied anybody else's territory, has it ever ended apart from, death, problems? I can't actually see this ongoing situation actually, doing anything different than any other war.
So your question is, how would this... it's been paraphrased by my colleague, how would this end? That's effectively your question, Mike.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Other than in, as you rightly say, occupied territories is not a great start. Perhaps we can stay with you, Lord Ricketts. Explain again to the listeners this expression, occupied territories, and it's a horrible question to ask you, sir, but how do you think this might end? Peter?
Well, it's the $64,000 question, isn't it? And thank you for it. The history is that Israel was created in a particular area, and then it occupied Palestinian areas in the wars of 1967 and 1973. So for the international community, there is the State of Israel that was born in 1948, and then there are the additional territories on the West Bank and Gaza that were Palestinian, at one point belonged to Jordan, and now are occupied by Israel. And I think the answer to the question in the long term is the question that all of us in the international diplomatic world have seen for decades. You can only have security for Israel if you can have a degree of peace and stability in the lands occupied by Palestinians, or the land of the Palestinians now occupied by Israel. So the deal is what it has always been, a swap of the occupied territories in return for a Palestinian state and guarantees for the State of Israel, so that Israel would never again face the awful kind of terrorism that they've had from Gaza. That was a possibility decades ago. Israeli governments have successfully built settlements on the occupied territories, and Mr. Netanyahu has even been talking about annexation of the occupied territories and otherwise declaring them full part of the State of Israel. At that point, a Palestinian state becomes impossible. And the big question then is, well, what future for the Palestinians? That's the problem here in Gaza as well. I can well imagine the Israeli forces can smash the Hamas organization with a ground invasion, wide number of casualties in all directions. But what then? Because you will still have 2.5 million people in Gaza. You still have several million people on the West Bank. They have no future, no prospects. How can we have a peaceful, stable region if one of the populations feels it has no future?
Let's bring Colonel Simon Diggins in on this. I know from other senior military personnel, Colonel, that the army, military, you train and train and train again for warfare, but you hope it never, ever actually happens to take place. Can you see that any side stepping back from this? Sadly, the conflict is only going to get worse and there'll be a higher death toll. Isn't that the reality, Simon?
I fear it probably is. As I said earlier on, I think Israel is now clear that they are going to try and eliminate Hamas. But the challenge is, how do you do that, as Rick said, without also then creating a massive humanitarian problem, almost a catastrophe, and killing lots and lots of innocent people? Your listener did ask a question, about occupied territories and the historical background to that. The implication of the question is entirely correct. Occupying lands, occupying other people's countries is not an easy thing to try and do. I served in Iraq. And while that was not supposed to be an occupation, the challenge, which was a very proper challenge that came down to us the whole time, was show what you're doing. It's not an occupation. That actually what you said you were doing, you were actually doing. And you do create resentment. You can sometimes get to a point where you establish kind of modus vivendi with the people working with you and explain that you're there for a short period of time and that you're working for a better future. And to some extent, we just about pulled that off in Iraq, but after a very long time and lots of bloodshed and lots of utter misery from there. We didn't make that work in Afghanistan, except in very limited areas, and that's always the challenge. And the Israelis are aware of that. I mean, life in the West Bank is very difficult, and continually creates tensions between, if you like, security, law and order, and the values of Israel, which, as one writers and speakers said earlier on, that this is a democratic country. They're one of the few true democratic countries in the Middle East. And I think that tension between their values and what they mean to do, and actually what they end up sometimes doing, if you like, as a forced occupation in the West Bank, is always going to be there. And that challenge, which is a moral and ethical and a legal challenge, is going to be even more to the fore in dealing with what they now have to do with Hamas and in Gaza. So, I mean, hugely problematic issues.
Let's finish with a final question from Jody. Thank you, Colonel. Final question from Jody in Highgate. Your question, Jody.
Hi there. Good morning to everybody.
Hello.
I was just wondering, the Gaza shares a border, of course, both with Israel and with Egypt. And considering the civilian catastrophe we're, potentially about to witness, why Egypt can't open its border to civilians in Gaza to, attempt to save some lives.
Let's put that to Lord Ricketts and, of course, other neighbouring countries, level of support there. Lord Ricketts?
Yes, well, Jody is absolutely right. The only other border that Gaza has is with Egypt. There is a crossing called the Rafah crossing, which is sometimes open to allow Gazans to get out and to the wider world. The Egyptians at the moment have closed that crossing. So there is no way out for the civilians of Gaza. Egypt, I think, is acutely worried by the tension in Gaza. It probably wants to avoid the arrival of thousands of Palestinians through the Rafah crossing. But you're right, it's probably the only way in for the rest of the world to help with humanitarian support. And I guess that the Egyptians are probably the best placed people in terms of mediating some sort of hostage exchange, which would be the first step towards reducing the tension. Right now, that crossing is closed and the people of Gaza are very desperate.